Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Independence and Dependence of Self-Consciousness, Lordship and Bondage. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it so exists for another, that is, it exists only in being acknowledged. The notion of this, its unity, in its duplication embraces many and varied meanings. Its moments then must on the one hand be held strictly apart, and on the other hand must in this differentiation at the same time also be taken and known as not distinct, or in their opposite significance. The twofold significance of the distinct moments has in the nature of self-consciousness to be infinite, or directly the opposite of the determinateness in which it is posited. The detailed exposition of the notion of this spiritual unity in its duplication will present us with the process of recognition. Self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. This has a twofold significance. First, it has lost itself, for it finds itself as an other being. Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other sees its own self. It must supersede this otherness of itself. This is the supersession of the first ambiguity, and is therefore itself a second ambiguity. First, it must proceed to supersede the other independent being, in order thereby to become certain of itself as the essential being. Secondly, in so doing, it proceeds to supersede its own self, for this other is itself. This ambiguous supersession of its ambiguous otherness is equally an ambiguous return into itself, for first, through the supersession, it receives back its own self, because by superseding its otherness, it again becomes equal to itself. But secondly, the other self-consciousness equally gives it back again to itself, for it saw itself in the other, but supersedes this being of itself in the other, and thus lets the other again go free. Now, this movement of self-consciousness in relation to another self-consciousness has in this way been represented as the action of one self-consciousness, but this action of the one has itself the double significance of being both its own action and the action of the other as well, for the other is equally independent and self-contained, and there is nothing in it of which it is not itself the origin. The first does not have the object before it merely as it exists primarily for desire, but as something that has an independent existence of its own, which therefore it cannot utilize for its own purposes, if that object does not of its own accord do what the first does to it. Thus the movement is simply the double movement of the two self-consciousnesses. Each sees the other do the same as it does. Each does itself what it demands of the other, and therefore also does what it does only insofar as the other does the same. Action by one side only would be useless, because what is to happen can only be brought about by both. Thus the action has a double significance, not only because it is directed against itself as well as against the other, but also because it is indivisibly the action of one as well as of the other. In this movement we see repeated the process which presented itself as the play of forces, but repeated now in consciousness. What in that process was for us is true here of the extremes themselves. The middle term is self-consciousness, which splits into the extremes, and each extreme is this exchanging of its own determinateness and an absolute transition into the opposite, although as consciousness it does indeed come out of itself, yet though out of itself it is at the same time kept back within itself, is for itself, and the self outside it is for it. It is aware that it at once is and is not another consciousness, and equally that this other is for itself only when it supersedes itself as being for itself, and is for itself only in the being for itself of the other. Each is for the other the middle term, though through which each mediates itself with itself and unites with itself, and each is for itself and for the other, an immediate being on its own account, which at the same time is such only through this mediation. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. We have now to see how the process of this pure notion of recognition, of the duplicating of self-consciousness in its oneness, appears to self-consciousness. At first it will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes, which as extremes are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing. Self-consciousness is, to begin with, simple being for self, self-equal through the exclusion from itself of everything else. For it, its essence and absolute object is I, and this in this immediacy, or in this mere being of its being for self, it is an individual. What is other for it is an unessential, negatively characterized object, but the other is also a self-consciousness. One individual is confronted by another individual. Appearing thus immediately on the scene, they are for one another like ordinary objects. Independent shapes, individual submerged in the being or immediacy of life, for the object in its immediacy is here determined as life. They are for each other shapes of consciousness which have not yet accomplished the movement of absolute abstraction, of rooting out all immediate being, and of being merely the purely negative being of self-identical consciousness. In other words, they have not as yet exposed themselves to each other in the form of pure being for self, or as self-consciousness. Each is indeed certain of its own self, but not of the other, and therefore its own self certainly still has no truth, for it would have truth only if its own being for self had confronted it as an independent object, or, what is the same thing, if the object had presented itself as this pure self-certainty. But according to the notion of recognition, this is possible only when each is for the other what the other is for it, only when each in its own self, through its own action, and again through the action of the other, achieves this pure abstraction of being for self. The presentation of itself, however, as the pure abstraction of self-consciousness, consists in showing itself as the pure negation of its objective mode, or in showing that it is not attached to any specific existence, not to the individuality common to existence as such, that it is not attached to life. This presentation is a twofold action on the part of the other, and action on its own part, insofar as it's the action of the other, each seeks the death of the other, but in doing so, the second kind of action on its own part, is also involved. For the former involves the staking of its own life. Thus the relation of two self-conscious individuals is such that they prove themselves and each other through life and death struggle. They must engage in this struggle, for they must raise their certainty of being for themselves to truth, both in the case of the other and in their own case, and it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won. Only thus is it proved that for self-consciousness its essential being is not just being, not the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather that there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as a vanishing moment, that it is only pure being for self. The individual who has not risked his life may well be recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. Similarly, just as each stakes his own life, so each must seek the other's death, for it values the other no more than itself. Its essential being is present to it in the form of an other. It is outside of itself and must rid itself of its self-externality. The other is an immediate consciousness, entangled in a variety of relationships, and it must regard its otherness as a pure being, for self, or as an absolute negation. This trial by death, however, does away with the truth which was supposed to issue from it, and so too with the certainty of self generally, for just as life is the natural setting of consciousness, independence without absolute negativity, so death is the natural negation of consciousness, negation without independence, which thus remains without the required significance of recognition. Death certainly shows that each staked his life and held it of no account, both in himself and in the other, but that is not for those who survived this struggle. They put an end to their consciousness in its alien setting of natural existence, that is to say, they put an end to themselves and are done away with as extremes wanting to be for themselves or to have an existence of their own. But with this there vanishes from their interplay its essential moment of splitting into extremes with opposite characteristics, and the middle term collapses into a lifeless unity, which is split into lifeless, merely immediate, unopposed extremes. And the two do not reciprocally give and receive one another back from each other, consciously, but leave each other free only indifferently, like things. Their act is an abstract negation, not the negation coming from consciousness, which supersedes in such a way as to preserve and maintain what is superseded, and consequently survives its own supersession.